Hey everyone, welcome to the 34th series of primary order and secondary organization from the logic of sense. This is the final series in the logic of sense proper, and is perhaps one of the most opaque or the most opaque, baffling and puzzling series in the entire book. I don't know if the word misdirection is accurate, but Deleuze is certainly playing tricks on the reader and requires them to sort of dig deeper and read between the lines and perhaps reference back to earlier parts in the book to make heads or tails of what's going on here. Indeed, it can be looked at as Zen koan, and at the very end of this series, which is the end of the book, Deleuze mentions that one needs to be, or he says, imagine that you are 1/3 Stoic, 1/3 Zen, and 1/3 Lewis Carroll. And everything here is starting off in the context still of Freudian psychology, Freudian analysis. So he begins again with the phantasm, revisiting that and saying how it's a resonance between two series. That is, it begins as a resonance between two series, between a pregenital series and a post-adolescent series. So again, looked at from the viewpoint of analysis, looking back at something that happened to you in your very early process of growth. And he says that it quickly, the resonance, which is the aleatory point, the object equals X or word equals X that goes between these two series, it soon induces what he calls a forced movement or an amplitude of the phantasm, which I guess he means by considering the phantasm as the phantasm develops, it gathers in energy, and that it's basically has a pendular motion that goes between what he earlier called the metaphysical surface and the depths. Now, just to digress for a second, one of the reasons I say misdirection is because Deleuze is often putting it into context of the surface collapsing into the depths, into what happens if the dynamic genesis, which this is all about, gets stifled or gets broken down or falls back into the depths. He'll talk about repression and regression. Repression being the falling of one dimension, the heights, into the depths. And but anyway, with this forced movement of the phantasm, he says that's the danger, that you fall back into the depths. And it can be looked at for people who go into examining themselves deeply or digging up stuff from deep inside of you, stuff that you might not be aware of if you hadn't taken the effort to do that. And it's the danger of getting caught up in the destructive drives of the depths. But there's a potential for success also, which is the creation of the metaphysical surface, or the extending of this metaphysical surface. And he's calling the two poles of this, the depths on the one hand, and he's calling the metaphysical surface the death instinct or Thanatos. Now, this is one of the things that I find might be a bit of misdirection, because he's defining, and this is common to Deleuze, as people who are fans of his work know, is that he tends to redefine or recontextualize definitions in his own way. So when he means the death instinct or the instinct of death, he's meaning it different than the standard Freudian definition of it. The Freudian definition of the death instinct is when you take an unnecessary risk something that might lead to death, like driving a car really fast or something like that. Deleuze, on the other hand, and this refers back to the earlier series of the 28th and 29th series, where he said the death instinct has a double value. So for him, the death instinct means surviving death, going beyond the death instinct. So in essence, he's talking about life, surviving the death of the body. If you go back and look at how he called the death instinct earlier and how he says about it now, he talks about a birth coming out of the death instinct. So he's using this term, the death instinct or instinct of death, as, the instinct of surviving death, of going beyond death. So he says when the metaphysical surface has the upper hand in its struggle with the depths, then a verb gets inscribed upon the surface, an infinitive verb, which he says the glorious event has a symbolic relationship with a state of affairs rather than merging with a state of affairs. And the shining noematic attribute is not confused with a quality, but is rather a sublimation, and that the result, and result he has in capitals, is an eternal truth. So that's what happens when the metaphysical surface has the upper hand. And he relates this to what he says that Lewis Carroll calls this impenetrability or radiancy. Now, impenetrability, he's referring to the section in through the looking glass where Alice comes upon Humpty Dumpty, and it's right after Humpty Dumpty says, "A word means whatever I want it to mean, no more or no less." So this is equivocation. And then he says impenetrability, and you should read that chapter. And then also the words glorious and shining, those adjectives that he used, relate both to this. And I advise rereading that chapter and Through the Looking Glass, because impenetrability, it's a little bit, he's using it as sort of nonsense, and I'm not sure exactly what Deleuze is getting at here. So the concept of radiancy is found in Lewis Carroll in 3 of his poems, which are Phantasmagoria, Beatrice, and Dreamland, and I'll provide links for them, and I highly suggest reading those. So back to the forced movement that we talked about earlier. He says, forced movement extends beyond the base and limits of life. So again, to the concept of his instinct of death as surviving death. And the greatest potential lies in the constitution of a metaphysical surface of great range, on which even the objects of the depths are projected. So this is, again, digging down into the depths and projecting them, bringing them to light, putting them on the metaphysical surface. So the 2 basic series we started with in the phantasm now become series of to eat and to think when they're on the metaphysical surface. Now, on the metaphysical surface, obviously, when he's talking about eating, he's not talking about eating food, because food, regular food, is not metaphysical. He means devouring things, or the way I look at it is G.I. Gurdjieff said there were 3 kinds of food, which is regular food, prana, which is the energy in breath, and then impressions. So I believe he's talking about eating in terms of taking in impressions and conjugating that with thinking. And so the result of that, Deleuze says, is speech. So this is when there is no when there is harmony between the mouth and the brain is when there's speech. And then the two series become to think and to speak. To speak causes the event as that which can be expressed by language. In the verb, the secondary organization is brought about, from which proceeds the whole ordering of language. And that'll eventually get us to the three aspects of the proposition: denotation, manifestation, and signification. And he calls that the tertiary ordering of language. Then Deleuze proceeds to state the sexual aspect of all this, which is in line with the Freudian view. And he says that the sexual organization is the prefiguration of the organization of language. And he's going to start talking about perversion, of how perversion is an art of the surface. And he wants to separate that from sexual crimes or sexual perversion, or, degenerate perversion, which is normally how we think of perversion. But if you actually look up the definition of perversion, it just means radically changing something. He's going to talk about how what we normally think of perversion is really subversion. When someone does something that we normally call perverted, he says that's really a subversion, meaning that it's something from the depths has risen up and taken over. And this is going to lead him into talking about repression and regression and crimes, talking about that come from the voice on high, that Freud has done a study of this and others, of the criminal who hears voices or gets instructions from the dimension on high. And so for me, all this is what I would call a little bit of a misdirection in terms of the dynamic genesis, because it's really sort of the opposite. But by the way, the secondary organization, the ordering of language, that is what he calls the static genesis. But he says you couldn't get to the static genesis without going through the dynamic genesis. And he doesn't ever really say the dynamic genesis ends, because at the very end of this chapter, he's going to talk about the problem of the work of art to come. And so it's up to the reader to decipher what this possible work of art could be. I think it has to do with surviving death, but people can reach their own conclusion. So related to his discussion of perversion and how it doesn't have to do with sexual crimes and whatnot, he's going to say that the real problem of perversion is shown correctly in the essential mechanism which corresponds to it, that of, and please excuse my pronunciation, it's a German word, verlignal. And this is another concept that Freud uses that Deleuze redefines or recontextualizes, because in the Freudian sense, it's German for denial. And Freud means it to mean something that's so horrible that's happened in your past that you deny its reality. It's connected to the repression and regression again, but it's just completely denied. But however, that is not how Deleuze is using this term. So Deleuze, in his redefinition of verlignal, uses the example of imagining a phallic object when you don't have a penis, which is the case for every woman. And this contradicts what he said much earlier when he said that the phallus is not related to a specific organ, it's related to an image. But that's what he uses, and he says that the verlignal is not an hallucination, but is an esoteric knowledge, which again is a very interesting way to redefine it, or a very different way of redefining it. And what I think he means to say, because the German translation of it is denial, and that in general, esoteric knowledge is not a hallucination. The kind of knowledge I've been talking about at the end of all of these videos, esoteric knowledge or hermetic knowledge, which tends to be denied by the limits of our culture, and also by conventional philosophy. All this stuff is like considered, you know, just woo-woo or whatever. Or the idea that something can survive death, that we can construct something, a metaphysical plane that can possibly survive death, or as Deleuze referred to it earlier, the speculative death instinct. He'll use the example of Lewis Carroll. He'll say, thus Carroll, perverse without crime, perverse but non-subversive, stuttering and left-handed, uses the desexualized energy of the photographic apparatus as a frightfully speculative eye in order to invest the sexual object par excellence, namely the little girl / phallus. Now, the photographic apparatus he's talking about was at the very end of the previous series where he talked about photographing this story of Emilia, which in the story, again, you have to read the secondary literature to sort of get an idea of what he's talking about. But in the story that he's referring to, this photographer wanted to photograph the ultimate beauty, and the sexual object that he calls the little girl / phallus. Little girl, I mean, he's playing off of, you know, Carroll's interest in photographing girls, but also the little girl is symbolically related to the desexualized energy of the evolving being. And this is where the paradox comes in, because you are trying to use sexual energy in a non-sexual way to invest in this phallus, this sort of energy that's going to be investing the metaphysical plane. Perverse conduct is also inseparable from a movement of the metaphysical surface, which, instead of repressing sexuality, uses desexualized energy in order to invest a sexual element, and as such, to fix it with unbearable attention, the second sense of fixation. So what's trying to be fixed is this metaphysical surface, to be realized, to be actualized. And the key is attention, unbearable attention. He does go into the primary order. I was wondering what he meant by the primary order. The primary order seems to be, he says, is where words are actions and passions. So the primary order he's talking about is the beginnings of sounds in the depths. The very, you know, before we hear the voice on high, before it's organized into semitemes, morphemes, and phonemes, and then, you know, becomes words and becomes the organization of language. The primary order starts from these sounds in the depths. And he calls this primary order demonic possessions or divine privations. And after talking about that, he seems to go into the direction of demonic possessions because he starts talking about obscenities and insults and how that has to do with the philosophic orientations and all that. And there's a footnote to Freud explaining about insults and what that means and the implications of insults. So he comes out of the discussion of regression and obscenities and insults back into sort of the Platonic ideals way of looking at things, which of course he's trying to overturn, but he's talking about sort of how we normally structure language and use language. And he talks about this way of looking at language has to do with the equivocation of denotations, the eminence of manifestation, and the analogies of signification. He says that you can equivocate so much that there can be an equivocation of equivocation such that it leads to univocity. And that's where he's wanting to get to when the sort of Platonic forms, or the Platonic way of looking at ideal forms is reversed or overturned, that it gets to univocity. Univocity is univocity of being. It's being that is the one voice that speaks through everything, according to Deleuze. So I'll just read what he says. An equivocation which ends equivocity and makes language ripe for something else. This something else is that which comes from the other, from the desexualized and metaphysical surface, when we finally go from speech to the verb, or when we compose a unique verb in the pure infinitive, or an eternal truth, along with the assembled words. This something else is the revelation of the univocal, the advent of univocity, that is the event in capital letters, which communicates the univocity of being to language. So this is sense, in other words. This is how we can go beyond the normal way of how we're seeing things in accordance with Plato's view and get to the event, get to sense, which can inform language in that way. So this leads us to the end of the series, which is the end of Logic of Sense proper. The conclusion, he says, it is necessary to imagine someone 1/3 Stoic, 1/3 Zen, and 1/3 Lewis Carroll. With one hand, he masturbates in an excessive gesture, and with the other, he writes in the sand the magic words of the pure event open to the univocal. And this is what Deleuze has him write, quote, mind dash I believe dash is dash essence, capital E. Ent, whatever that means, dash abstract, dash that, dash is, dash an, dash accident, dash which we, dash that is to say, dash I meant, dash. Thus, he makes the sexual energy of the masturbation go into the asexual energy of language through writing something. And then he compares this to Bloom on the beach. And what he's referring to is the episode in James Joyce's Ulysses where the main character, Leopold Bloom, is on the beach in Dublin, and he sees a young girl and he starts masturbating. And, you know, there's this sexual energy coming out. And at the very end of that scene in Ulysses, Bloom starts writing something on the beach, and he writes, "I am a," and then he stops writing. And some people believe because he ran out of room to write, and other people speculate about what he was going to write. But it's interesting that Deleuze leaves it this way, because he talks about the problem of a work yet to come. And so I am a what it is, what are you constructing? And Deleuze will just recapitulate the whole thing again at the very end, in the very last sentence. And this sentence reads, what can the work of art do but follow again the path which goes from noise to the voice, from voice to speech, and from speech to the verb, constructing this music für ein Haus, again, excuse my German pronunciation, in order always to recover the independence of sounds and to fix the thunderbolt of the univocal. This event is, of course, quickly covered over by everyday banality, or on the contrary, by the sufferings of madness. Now, in this very last sentence, what he's talking about is what the Sufis call waking up. So getting beyond all the illusion, the Maya, the samsara, the dream of how we normally see things, how we normally represent the word to us. But this waking state is quickly covered up by, you know, the banality of how we normally see things, unless, you know, it leads to madness. So, you know, this is, it doesn't leave us on a very hopeful note, but, you know, there's a reason for that. I mean, it takes courage and determination to stay awake, to keep waking up, to keep that process going, to form that work of art, which is I am, you know, leaving it blank to whatever it is, that whatever the becoming is. And, you know, the very first series was on becomings, and the very end of the book is talking about a becoming of something beyond. The language I just read that he used at the end, the German, Musik für ein Haus, means music for a house. And this is very symbolic. He's talking about the music, what it is that constructs something, that makes a structure for a house. Now, Kabbalistically, house is the meaning of the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is Beth, and that's connected to the Magus card in the Tarot, or to magic. So the music for the magic of creating this metaphysical surface, or creating this work of art to come, whatever that is, this dynamic genesis that doesn't necessarily have to end. And then the other word he uses that's very interesting, and to fix the thunderbolt of the univocal. The word thunderbolt. And again, if we go back to Joyce, Joyce has these thunder words, and Joyce refers to Vico's concept that language began when primitive man started trying to describe thunder, which they conceived of as God. So that's Joyce's idea of the beginning, you know, or speculation of the beginning of language, or Joyce uses Vico's speculation for the beginning of language. But thunderbolt in the esoteric sense means being struck by something very divine, by something very powerful. Now, just back to music für ein Haus. That was also the name of a project, a musical project, a composition by Karl Heinz Stockhausen that he did in 1968. So I think I'm going to provide a link to that. It's very interesting. It consisted of 14 different composers bringing their own compositions and making this structure, this creation of experimental music. And again, I think that's exactly what, Deleuze was referencing there. So anyway, I will have one more video, which will be a conclusion of all this, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and talk to you again.